Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. The Galactic Combat Institute on Drafon Prime was, without question, the most prestigious training facility for young predators in 8 sectors. And yes, before you ask, that's exactly as pretentious as it sounds. Picture? Wait, no, scratch that. Consider this: a sprawling complex of reinforced durasteel and energy barriers, where the galaxy's most dangerous species sent their offspring to learn the ancient art of not getting their tails handed to them in combat. The architecture screamed, "We have money and want you to know it." All sleek curves and unnecessary holographic displays that probably cost more than a small moon. In Training Arena 12, Ivy stood with her arms crossed, watching 5 young aliens attempt what she generously called a basic defensive drill. The results were, to put it mildly, catastrophic. "Wraith!" she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Your left flank is wide open. Again." The scaled reptilian, all 8 feet of bronze-colored muscle and adolescent attitude, hissed in frustration. His species, the Dramic, were ambush predators from a jungle world where patience was survival. Patience, however, did not translate well to hand-to-hand combat drills, and Wraith had the ego of a creature who'd never met a food chain he wasn't on top of. "This is pointless," Wraith grumbled, his forked tongue flicking out in annoyance. "No prey stands still like this." "Good thing you're not hunting prey, then," Ivy replied, her tone as dry as a desert planet. "You're learning to fight peers. Big difference." Bon, a furred quadruped from the pack-hunting phoenix species, padded over on all 4s. His kind looked like someone had crossed a wolf with a bear, and given the result opposable thumbs and a bad attitude. "Instructor Ivy, perhaps we could move on to more advanced techniques?" "Advanced?" Ivy raised an eyebrow. "Bon, you tripped over your own feet twice in the last 5 minutes. Let's master walking before we try flying, yeah?" The other cubs snickered. "Well," Grix clicked her mandibles in what passed for laughter among her kind, and Pella made a burbling sound that Ivy had learned meant amusement. The insectoid, Grix, was all chitinous plates and blade-like forearms that could slice through steel if she wasn't careful. She was careful, mostly, which was why Ivy liked her. Pella, on the other hand, was an amphibious creature with toxic skin and too many eyes, hailing from a swamp world where everything was either poisonous or trying to eat you. Often both. "Again, from the top," Ivy said, clapping her hands together. "And this time, Wraith, try to remember that you have a right side. I know it's shocking, but it exists." The thing was, Ivy knew she was boring them. These kids, and yes, they were kids, even if Wraith could probably bench press a hover car, came from species that had clawed their way to the top of their respective food chains through raw, brutal efficiency. They were born with advantages: venom, armor, claws, strength that made Earth gorillas look like house cats. Humans were classified as Class 4 persistence predators, which was a fancy way of saying annoying endurance joggers who won't leave you alone. Not exactly impressive when you're teaching the children of apex hunters. The cubs went through the motions, their movements telegraphing boredom louder than a supernova. Ivy sighed internally. 3 years she'd been teaching at the Institute, and the routine was always the same. Show up, demonstrate basic techniques that any human martial artist could do in their sleep, watch alien cubs yawn through the material because they thought their natural advantages made them invincible. She wasn't mad about it. How could she be? These kids didn't know any better. The galaxy had spent millennia categorizing species by their hunting methods, And humans just didn't rank high on the scary predator scale. Tool users, pack hunters, persistence predators, all technically correct, all fundamentally missing the point. But that wasn't her problem to solve. Her job was to teach defensive basics and hope these cubs didn't get themselves killed when they graduated to real combat scenarios. "All right, that's enough for," Ivy started to say. The alarm cut her off. Not the standard end of session chime, but the kind of alarm that made your stomach drop and your instincts scream. Deep, resonating pulses of sound that vibrated through the floor, accompanied by flashing red emergency lights that turned the arena into a disco of impending doom. "Lockdown protocol initiated," an automated voice announced, with the kind of calm that only AI could manage during a crisis. "All personnel evacuate to designated safe zones. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." The cubs froze, their various sensory organs swiveling toward Ivy. Even through their alien features, she could read the universal expression. What now? Ivy's personal comm unit buzzed against her wrist. She glanced down at the message, and her jaw tightened. "Security breach. Xenobiology, wing, nethrack specimen, containment, failure, threat level, extinction event. All non-combat personnel evacuate immediately." Oh, that was bad. The nethrack were, how to put this delicately, walking nightmares that made other apex predators look like cuddly pets. 9 feet of armored exoskeleton, 4 arms ending in claws that could rend through battle plating, and a jaw structure that suggested evolution had one goal: make everything else extinct. They were so dangerous that most civilized worlds had banned them from settled space. The Institute kept one, in maximum security containment for research purposes. Research purposes. Right, because keeping a creature classified as a galactic threat-level extinction event in a school was definitely a good idea. Everyone, with me. Now. Ivy's voice shifted from bored instructor to something else, something that made even Wraith stop posturing and listen. The cubs followed her across the arena floor, questions tumbling over each other in a cacophony of hisses, growls, and clicks. "What's happening? Is it an attack? Why aren't we fighting?" Ivy didn't answer, just moved with purpose toward the reinforced observation room at the arena's edge. The door was solid durasteel, designed to withstand weapons fire, and, more importantly, enthusiastic cubs who didn't know their own strength. She ushered them inside, the space barely large enough for all 5 plus their very confused instructor. "Instructor Ivy?" Pella's voice was quiet, her multiple eyes blinking in a cascade of concern. "What is it?" "Stay here," Ivy said, her hand on the door control. "Stay quiet. Stay away from the glass. And whatever happens," she looked at each of them in turn, her expression unreadable. "Pay attention. Consider it your final exam." "Final exam?" Bond's ears flattened against his skull. "For what?" "For understanding what Apex really means." The door sealed shut with a hiss of pressurized air. Through the transparent aluminum viewing panel, the cubs watched as Ivy walked back out into the center of the arena, alone, small, and apparently insane. "She's leaving?" Grix's mandibles clicked in confusion. "Why is she leaving?" The other instructors were visible on the facility's external cameras, displayed on monitors in the observation room. Adult Dremic, Phoenix, and half a dozen other species, all armed, all evacuating. Running. But the human just stood there, in the middle of the empty arena, waiting. "This doesn't make sense," Wraith said, his voice uncertain for the first time since Ivy had met him. "She should be running. Humans are not combat rated for..." The far entrance to the arena exploded inward. Not opened, not breached, exploded. The Durasteel door, rated to withstand anti-vehicle weapons, crumpled like paper as something massive forced its way through. The nethrack entered the arena, and every cub pressed instinctively against the back wall of the observation room. It was bigger than the specifications suggested. Easily 9 feet tall, probably closer to 10. Its exoskeleton the color of deep space, black, with an iridescent sheen that caught the emergency lighting. 4 arms, each ending in claws that looked like they could disembowel a tank. Its head was all angles and edges, built for ramming and biting, with eyes that glowed a sickly yellow. And it was looking right at Ivy. "She's going to die," Vaughn whispered, his voice barely audible. "We have to do something. We have to—" "She told us to watch," Pella said, though her toxic skin had flushed to a pale, frightened green. "She said to pay attention." The nethrack took a step forward, then another, its massive bulk moving with the confidence of a creature that had never, not once, been prey. Why would it? In the galactic hierarchy, nethracks sat at the absolute pinnacle. They hunted for sport. They'd wiped out species because they were bored. Ivy didn't move. The cubs stared, transfixed, as their instructor, their small, soft, allegedly non-threatening human instructor, just stood there, watching the approaching death machine with an expression that was she smiling? "Why isn't she running?" Wraith's voice cracked slightly. "Why isn't she doing anything?" Ivy reached down to the equipment rack beside her, where training weapons sat in neat rows. She bypassed the shock batons, the stun rifles, the energy shields. Her hand closed around a training baton. Just a stick, really. Polymer composite, about 3 feet long, designed for practice drills. She was going to fight a nethrack with a stick. "This is insane," Grix clicked. "This is actually insane." The nethrack roared, a sound that vibrated through the observation room's walls and made every cub's survival instincts scream in primal terror. It charged, 4 arms spread wide, claws extended, moving with horrifying speed for something so large. Ivy rolled her shoulders once, casually, like she was warming up for a light jog. And then she moved. Not away. Not back. She stepped forward, into the charge, and at the last possible second, the absolute last moment before those claws would have turned her into abstract art, she simply wasn't there anymore. The nethrack stumbled, confused, its momentum carrying it past where its prey had been standing. It whirled around, faster than something that size had any right to move. Ivy was behind it, the training baton resting casually on her shoulder. "Okay, class," she called out, her voice carrying across the arena to the observation room as if she were still teaching a standard drill. "First lesson, never commit fully to a charge unless you're absolutely sure of the kill. Notice how our friend here telegraphed with its left shoulders? That's your opening." She was teaching. She was actively being hunted by a walking extinction event, and she was still teaching. Is she actually doing this?" Vaughn asked, his voice climbing an octave. The nethrack charged again, learning nothing, and this time Ivy didn't just dodge. She moved with it, flowing around its attack like water, and as she passed, the training baton whipped out in a precise strike against the joint of its lower left arm. The crack echoed through the arena. The nethrack shrieked, not in pain but in surprise. Something had actually hit it. Something had dared to strike back. Ivy laughed. Not nervously, not scared. She laughed like someone who'd just heard the galaxy's funniest joke. "Oh, you're not used to that, are you?" she said, circling now, light on her feet. Usually, things just die when you look at them. Must be nice. The cubs watched in absolute silence as their instructor, the boring one who taught basic defensive techniques, began to systematically dissect one of the galaxy's most dangerous predators. And somewhere in that silence, Bond whispered the question that would haunt them all. Why is she Apex? Wearing human skin? The thing about watching someone fight a creature that could theoretically eat a small starship is that it really puts your entire education into perspective. The cubs had spent months learning combat theory from various instructors. The Dremic taught ambush tactics. The Phoenix demonstrated pack coordination. The insectoid Rethkar showed precision strikes. Every lesson had been predicated on one simple assumption: use your natural advantages to overwhelm your opponent. Ivy had no natural advantages, at least none that the galactic classification system recognized. What she had, apparently, was spite and pattern recognition, and a complete absence of the survival instinct that should be screaming at her to run. The nethrack lunged again, all four arms sweeping in a coordinated attack pattern that should have been impossible to avoid. The cubs knew this pattern. They'd studied nethrack combat footage in their xenobiology classes. It was called the extinction sweep for a reason. No recorded creature had ever survived it at close range. Ivy dropped to the ground, flat, and the claws passed over her with inches to spare. Before the nethrack could adjust, she'd rolled between its legs. Actually, between its legs, which was either brilliant or absolutely unhinged, and came up behind it. The training baton cracked against the back of its knee joint. The nethrack buckled, just slightly, but enough. Enough for Ivy to dart away before it could bring those rear arms around in a backswing that would have pulverized her. "See that?" Ivy called out, slightly breathless now, but still maintaining that teaching voice. "Armor always has weak points. Evolution optimizes, but it can't protect everything. Find the joints. Find the gaps." "She's insane," Wraith breathed, his scales rippling with involuntary fear response. "She's actually insane." "No," Pella said quietly, all of her eyes fixed on the human. "She knows something we don't." The nethrack was getting frustrated now. The cubs could see it in the way it moved, more aggressive, less calculated. It wasn't used to prey that fought back. It wasn't used to prey that studied it. Ivy, on the other hand, looked almost relaxed. Not calm, there was too much intensity in her eyes for that, but comfortable. Like this was familiar territory. She circled left, forcing the nethrack to turn to keep her in sight. The creature obliged, and the cubs noticed something they'd missed before. Ivy was controlling the engagement. She was deciding where they fought, how they moved, when they clashed. "How is she doing that?" Grix clicked, her mandibles twitching. "It's bigger, stronger, faster." "But she's smarter," Bond finished, his ears perked forward in fascination. "She's not reacting. She's predicting." The nethrack charged again, and this time Ivy didn't dodge. She stepped into the charge, which was suicide, except she'd timed it perfectly. Her training baton jabbed upward, catching the creature in what passed for a throat, right in the soft tissue between armored plates. The nethrack choked, stumbled, and Ivy was already moving, circling around to its blind spot. "Breathing patterns," she narrated, her voice steady despite the exertion. "Everything needs to breathe. Hit the diaphragm, disrupt the rhythm. Suddenly that armor's not so useful when you can't get oxygen to your muscles." She wasn't just fighting. She was performing surgery with violence, each strike calculated, each movement purposeful. The nethrack spun, faster than before, catching Ivy with the edge of its upper right claw. The cubs gasped as their instructor went flying, hitting the arena floor and rolling with the momentum. "She's hurt," Wraith said, pressing against the glass. "She has to retreat now. She has to." Ivy stood up. There was a tear in her uniform where the claw had caught her, a thin line of red visible underneath. She looked down at it, then back up at the nethrack, and she grinned. Actually grinned, like this was the most fun she'd had in years. "Okay," she said, her voice dropping lower, losing some of that instructional cheerfulness. "Okay, now we're talking." Something changed in the way she moved. Before, she'd been methodical, educational. Now? Now she looked like something else entirely. The nethrack charged again, but this time Ivy met it head-on. She slid under its first strike, popped up inside its guard, and the training baton became a blur. 1, 2, 3 strikes in rapid succession. Joint, nerve cluster, sensory organ. Each impact precise, each one targeting a specific weakness. The creature howled, actually howled in pain, and swiped wildly. Ivy was already gone, repositioning, circling. "Notice the breathing," she continued, and the cubs realized with mounting horror that she was still teaching. "It's getting slower. That's fatigue setting in. Doesn't matter how strong you are if you can't maintain it." "Persistence hunting," Pella whispered, her skin flushing with realization. "She's persistence hunting it." Bond's eyes widened. "But that takes hours. Days, sometimes. How is she—" "Because it's not used to being prey," Grix finished, understanding dawning in her compound eyes. "It doesn't know how to pace itself. It's burning through energy trying to catch her." And it was true. The nethrack was moving slower now, its attacks more desperate, less coordinated. It had probably never had to fight for more than a few seconds before. Why would it? Everything died quickly when you were an extinction-level threat. Everything except, apparently, one extremely stubborn human. Ivy struck again, this time targeting the creature's eyes. The training baton connected with the sensory organ, and the nethrack reeled back, partially blinded, ichor dripping from the wound. "Sensory deprivation," Ivy said, breathing harder now but still in control. "Take away their advantages one by one. Make them fight on your terms, not theirs." The arena floor was marked with the nethrack's ichor now, little trails of yellow-green fluid that showed where Ivy had landed strikes. None of them were killing blows. All of them were debilitating. She was taking it apart, piece by piece. "Why doesn't she just kill it?" Wraith asked, confused. "She's had openings. I've seen at least 3 where she could have gone for a vital organ." "Because she's not trying to kill it," Bond said slowly. "She's trying to teach us something." The nethrack was slowing down considerably now. Its movements were sluggish, its attacks telegraphed well in advance. It was exhausted, confused, and for probably the first time in its life, scared. Ivy saw the fear. The cubs saw her see it. Her expression changed, just for a moment. Something almost like sadness flickered across her face. She lowered the training baton slightly. "You know what the difference is between an apex predator and everything else?" she asked. And it took the cubs a moment to realize she was talking to them now, not the nethrack. "It's not about being the biggest, not about being the strongest or the fastest or having the best weapons." The nethrack lunged, one last desperate attack, and Ivy sidestepped it almost casually. "It's about knowing when you've won," she continued, "and choosing what to do with that victory." She moved then, faster than she had the entire fight, and the training baton struck 3 times in rapid succession. The cubs couldn't even track the movements, but the result was immediate. The nethrack's entire body seized up, muscles locking, and it crashed to the arena floor like a felled tree. Ivy stood over it, chest heaving, that torn uniform showing the shallow cut underneath. The training baton cracked down the middle from the force of her strikes. The creature was still alive, paralyzed, but alive. "Nerve clusters," Ivy said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Non-lethal takedown. Works on most species if you know where to hit." She paused. "Hurts like hell, though. Sorry about that, big guy." The emergency alarm was still blaring, but it felt distant now, irrelevant. The security team would arrive soon, armed with weapons that could actually put the nethrack down permanently if needed. But Ivy had done it with a stick, a training stick, and she'd done it while teaching. The cubs stared through the observation window, none of them speaking, all of them trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Their instructor, the boring human who taught defensive basics, had just systematically dismantled one of the galaxy's most dangerous creatures, while giving them a running commentary on technique. Ivy turned toward the observation room, and even through the distance, the cubs could see her eyes. There was something in them that hadn't been there during regular training sessions, something old, something tired, something that had seen too much and done things that probably shouldn't be spoken about. She walked toward the door, each step measured, and pressed the release mechanism. The door slid open with a hiss. "So," Ivy said, looking at each of the cubs in turn. "Anyone still think this was pointless?" Nobody answered. Nobody could answer. Behind her, the nethrack twitched feebly on the arena floor, and the sound of running boots echoed in the hallways as the security team finally arrived. Ivy stepped into the observation room, and 5 young predators, cubs from apex species, born hunters, naturally dangerous, all took an involuntary step backward. Not because she was threatening them, but because they suddenly understood what they'd been too blind to see before. The human was apex. She'd always been apex. The galaxy had just used the wrong classification system. "Well," Ivy prompted, wiping a strand of hair from her face, leaving a small smear of ichor across her forehead. "Class isn't over yet. What did we learn today?" The cubs looked at each other. Then, as if choreographed, they all looked back at their instructor. And for the first time since they'd started training under her, they actually saw her. The security team burst into the arena like they were storming a hostile installation, weapons drawn, armor gleaming, ready to face down an extinction-level threat. What they found instead was one paralyzed nethrack, 5 traumatized cubs, and Ivy leaning against the observation room doorframe like she'd just finished a light workout instead of, defeating a walking apocalypse with what amounted to a fancy stick. The team leader, a grizzled phoenix named Dorek, lowered his plasma rifle slowly, his eyes darting between Ivy and the massive creature sprawled across the arena floor. "Instructor Ivy," he said carefully, like he was talking to someone who might be suffering from shock. Did you?" "Yep," Ivy said, popping the P sound. "Nerve cluster strikes. It'll be paralyzed for about 20 minutes, give or take. Probably want to get it back to containment before it wakes up cranky." Dorek stared at her, then at the nethrack, then back at her. "With a training baton," he said flatly. "Technically with most of a training baton." Ivy held up the cracked weapon. This part broke off around the 3rd spinal strike. The security team just stood there. Professional soldiers, trained for exactly this kind of emergency, and they were frozen like someone had hit their pause button. "Right," Dorek finally managed. "We'll handle the containment. You should report to medical. That's protocol for—" "It's a scratch," Ivy interrupted, glancing down at the cut on her side. I've had worse paper cuts. That was probably a lie. The cubs could see the blood seeping through her uniform. But Ivy's expression suggested that arguing would be pointless, and apparently Dorek agreed because he just nodded and started barking orders at his team. Ivy turned back to the cubs, who were still pressed against the back wall of the observation room like someone had glued them there. "Okay," she said, her voice shifting back to instructor mode. "Let's debrief while this is fresh. Wraith, what did you observe?" Wraith's mouth opened, closed, opened again. His forked tongue flickered in confusion. That was... Complete sentences, please. You have a tongue. Use it for words." "You fought a nethrack," Wraith finally blurted out. "You fought a nethrack and you won! With a stick! How is that even possible? You're a human! You're not even rated for—" "Rated for what?" Ivy asked, her tone sharpening slightly. "Combat? Survival? Defending students?" Wraith fell silent, his scales rippling with emotions the cubs didn't have names for. Ivy sighed, and suddenly she looked very, very tired. Not physically tired, though the cubs suspected she'd feel this fight tomorrow, but the kind of tired that came from carrying something heavy for too long. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the floor. Nobody moved. That wasn't a suggestion. 5 young predators sat, quickly. Ivy joined them, lowering herself to the ground with a slight wince that she tried to hide. The cubs noticed anyway. They noticed everything now, hyper-aware of every movement, every expression, every micro-gesture from the human who'd just rewritten their understanding of the universe. "You want to know what I am?" Ivy asked, looking at each of them in turn. "Fine. Let's talk about it." Outside, the security team was carefully loading the nethrack onto a reinforced hover stretcher, giving the observation room a very wide berth. Earth, Ivy began, didn't have one apex predator. It had dozens, hundreds, if you count the ones that went extinct before humans showed up. Big cats, bears, wolves, crocodilians, venomous snakes, venomous spiders, venomous fish. Venomous everything, honestly. Earth really committed to the "everything is trying to kill you" aesthetic. Bond's ears twitched. But humans don't have venom, or claws, or armor, or anything that would make them scary, right? Ivy finished. That's what the galactic classification says. Humans are persistence predators, class 4. We can jog for a really long time, and that's about it. Not impressive compared to species that can breathe fire or regenerate limbs. "But that's wrong," Pella said quietly. "Obviously, that's wrong." "Is it, though?" Ivy asked. "Everything in that classification is technically accurate. Humans do hunt through persistence. We are pack animals. We do rely heavily on tools. None of that is false." "Then what's the truth?" Grix clicked, her mandibles tight with confusion. Ivy was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. Not softer, exactly, but more honest. Raw. "The truth is that humans got good at killing because we had to. We weren't the biggest. We weren't the fastest. We didn't have natural weapons. So we learned to think our way to the top. We learned to read patterns, predict behavior, exploit weaknesses. We learned to turn sticks into spears, rocks into hammers, and every single thing in our environment into a potential tool." She held up the broken training baton. "This isn't a weapon. It's a stick. But I know exactly how much force it takes to disrupt a nerve cluster. I know which joints on a nethrack's body support its weight distribution. I know that its armor has gaps at specific points for flexibility. I know all of this because humans spent thousands of years studying how to kill things that were bigger and stronger than us." The cubs absorbed this in silence. But here's the thing, Ivy continued, and now she was looking directly at Wraith. You asked how it's possible, how a human could defeat a nethrack. You know what the real answer is? It's not about being possible or impossible. It's about necessity. I don't understand, Wraith said. That creature? Ivy gestured toward the arena where the nethrack was being carted away. It's never been prey before. It doesn't know how to be prey. Its entire existence has been about being the scariest thing in any room it enters. But humans? We started as prey. We started as food for things with bigger teeth. And we clawed our way up from the bottom by being too stubborn to die and too smart to fight fair. She stood up, wincing again, but pushing through it. Your species became apex by being born with advantages. Mine did it by refusing to accept disadvantages. That's the difference. Bon raised a paw hesitantly. But the classification system... The classification system is designed to categorize species by their primary hunting method, Ivy interrupted. It's not designed to measure how dangerous they are, because danger isn't about how you hunt. It's about what you do when you're cornered. Outside, alarms were finally being silenced. The facility was returning to normal, or whatever passed for normal after a containment breach. I have a question, Pella said, her multiple eyes blinking in sequence. Why didn't you kill it? Ivy looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in her expression. Because that's what separates apex predators from monsters, she said quietly. The choice, I could have killed it. Easily. There were at least 5 moments where I had clean strikes to vital organs. But killing it wouldn't have taught you anything except that violence is the only solution. But it's a nethrack, Grix protested. It would have killed you without hesitation. Probably, Ivy agreed. But I'm not a nethrack. I don't kill because it's easy, or because I can. I kill when I have to, when there's no other option. That thing? She jerked her thumb toward the arena. It was scared, confused, lashing out because that's all it knows. Putting it down permanently would have been the easy choice, the cruel choice. She looked at each of them again, her gaze intense. You all have the capacity to be dangerous. Your species are predators, hunters, survivors. What I'm here to teach you isn't how to fight. You all know how to fight. I'm here to teach you when not to fight, when to show mercy, when to choose restraint over reflex. The cubs sat in silence, processing this. Finally, Bon spoke, his voice small. Instructor Ivy, have you been holding back in our training? Ivy's expression softened, and she actually smiled. Not the predatory grin from the fight, but something warmer, tinged with sadness. What do you think? She asked. The answer was obvious. Of course she'd been holding back. Every drill, every demonstration, every correction, she'd been operating at a fraction of her capability, carefully calibrated to teach without terrifying. They'd been learning from an apex predator who'd spent 3 years pretending to be harmless. Tomorrow, Wraith said suddenly, his voice stronger now. What are we learning? Ivy raised an eyebrow. Depends. You all ready to actually pay attention for once? 5 heads nodded in unison, enthusiasm mixing with newfound wariness and respect. Good, Ivy said, heading toward the door, because we're starting endurance training. Hope you brought comfortable shoes. We're going running. The collective groan from the cubs was immediate and heartfelt. They'd all heard the horror stories about human endurance training, the species that could literally run prey to death. Ivy paused at the door, looking back with that small smile still in place. Oh, and cubs? Welcome to the real class. Try to keep up. The medical wing had seen Ivy exactly once in 3 years, and that was for a mandatory checkup. Now, as she sat on the examination table while a concerned Rethkar medic fussed over her side, she looked about as comfortable as a caged predator. Which, the cubs were beginning to realize, might not be far from the truth. They'd followed her. Not because she'd asked them to, but because none of them could quite bring themselves to leave. Something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of the universe, and they needed to stay close to the source of that shift. "It's shallow," the medic clicked, her compound eyes reflecting the sterile lighting. "You're fortunate the claw didn't go deeper." "Fortune had nothing to do with it," Ivy replied, holding still as the medic applied a regenerative patch. "I angled away at the last second. Took a graze instead of a gutting." The medic paused, staring at Ivy with all 16 eyes. "You calculated that? In the moment?" "Didn't really have time not to." The cubs exchanged glances. The revelation just kept coming, didn't it? Each detail adding another layer to their complete misunderstanding of their instructor. Director Bayan arrived then, a towering Dremic with ceremonial markings that denoted her status. She was old, experienced, and currently looking at Ivy with an expression that mixed concern, confusion, and something that might have been respect. "Instructor Ivy," she began, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "I need a full debrief of nerve cluster strikes to induce temporary paralysis." Ivy interrupted, not looking away from the medic's work. "No permanent damage to the specimen. It can return to containment once the paralysis wears off. The cubs are unharmed. Arena sustained minimal damage. That cover everything?" Director Bayan's jaw worked silently for a moment. "You fought a nethrack," she finally said. "With a training implement." "Yep." "That is not standard protocol for—" "Standard protocol was evacuation," Ivy agreed, "which I initiated for the cubs. Then I made a tactical decision to contain the threat rather than let it roam through a facility full of students." "Contain," Director Bayan repeated slowly. "You contained an extinction-level threat." "Seemed like the thing to do at the time." The director looked like she wanted to argue or possibly promote Ivy, or maybe have her psychologically evaluated, possibly all three at once. Instead, she just sighed, a long, hissing sound that spoke of battles not worth fighting. "The board will want a full incident report," she said, "and probably several meetings about security protocols, and possibly a review of human threat classifications." "Looking forward to it," Ivy said dryly. The medic finished with the patch and stepped back, allowing Ivy to slide off the examination table. "If we're done here, I have a class to prep for tomorrow." "About that," Wraith spoke up, finding his voice for the first time since they'd entered medical. "What you said. About endurance training. You were serious?" Ivy looked at him, and despite everything they'd witnessed, her expression was gentle. "Dead serious. You want to learn how humans hunt? That's where we start. Not with strength or speed or natural weapons. We start with the ability to just keep going." "But why?" Grix clicked, genuinely curious now rather than dismissive. "We have advantages. Natural abilities. Why would we need to learn persistence?" "Because advantages can be countered," Ivy said. "Natural abilities can fail. But willpower? Stubbornness? The refusal to quit, even when everything logical says you should? That's universal. That works regardless of species." Bond's tail was wagging slightly, an unconscious sign of excitement. "You're going to teach us to fight like humans." "No," Ivy corrected. "I'm going to teach you to think like humans. Fighting is just the application." Director Bayan cleared her throat. I should mention that this incident will likely attract attention. Galactic media, perhaps. Questions about human capabilities. Great, Ivy muttered. Just what I need. You could have died, Pella said suddenly, her voice quiet but cutting through the conversation. You knew you could die, and you still walked out there. Why? Ivy was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost all the sarcasm, all the dry humor that usually colored her words. Because you were my students, she said simply. And I made a promise when I took this job that no harm would come to any kid under my instruction. That promise doesn't have exceptions for inconvenient circumstances. The cubs absorbed this, and something in their expressions shifted. It wasn't fear anymore, or shock. It was something closer to understanding. Tomorrow morning, Ivy said, addressing them directly. Arena 12. 0800 hours. Wear comfortable clothes. Bring water. And prepare yourselves for the most boring, frustrating, and valuable lesson you'll ever receive. What lesson is that? Wraith asked. How to suffer productively, Ivy said with a slight grin. Human specialty. Director Bayan excused herself with promises of paperwork and incident reviews. The medic returned to her duties, and Ivy started walking toward the exit, the cubs trailing behind her like cubs following their pack leader. Instructor Ivy, Bond called out as they reached the corridor junction where they'd need to split off toward the dormitories. Ivy turned back. What you did today, Bond continued, his ears flattening slightly in what might have been respect. That was Apex. Real Apex. Ivy's expression softened. You want to know the secret? She asked, and the cubs leaned in instinctively. Apex isn't about being the strongest or the fastest or the most dangerous. It's about being the one still standing when everything else has given up. That's what makes something truly Apex. Not the ability to dominate, but the refusal to be dominated. She looked at each of them in turn. You're all born with gifts, natural weapons, enhanced senses, physical advantages I'll never have. But gifts only take you so far. What matters is what you do when those gifts aren't enough. When you're outmatched, outgunned, and the smart choice is to retreat. And then? Grix asked. And then you make the choice, Ivy said. You decide who you are, predator or prey, apex or victim, and you live with that choice. The cubs stood in silence, processing this final lesson of the day. Get some rest, Ivy said, turning to leave. Tomorrow we find out if you're as tough as you think you are. As she walked away, the cubs watched her go. This small, scarred, impossibly dangerous human who'd spent 3 years teaching them basics, while hiding the fact that she was probably the most lethal thing in the facility. We're learning from a monster, Wraith said quietly, echoing his earlier observation. No, Pella corrected, her skin flushing with newfound understanding. We're learning from something better, a monster who chose not to be one. Bond watched Ivy disappear around the corner. Tomorrow's going to be awful, isn't it? He asked. Probably, Grix agreed. Good, Wraith said, his scales settling into a pattern that indicated determination. I want to learn everything she knows. The others nodded in agreement. Somewhere in the facility, a contained nethrack was beginning to regain sensation in its limbs, slowly coming to terms with the fact that it had been defeated by something smaller, weaker, and supposedly non-threatening. And in the quiet corridors of the Galactic Combat Institute, 5 young predators returned to their dormitories with a new understanding. The galaxy had spent so long cataloging what made species dangerous, the claws, the venom, the armor, the size, that they'd completely missed the ones who became dangerous despite having none of those things. The ones who just wouldn't stop. The ones who chose, every single day, to be apex. The ones wearing human skin. Tomorrow, their real education would begin. Tonight, they'd try to sleep, knowing that everything they thought they understood about predators, about danger, about what it meant to be apex, had been completely, fundamentally wrong. And honestly, they couldn't wait to learn more.